And now we're going to turn to Albany, where the state Senate has advanced legislation that would set term limits for members of the state legislature. The bill passed by a vote of 55-7 with bipartisan support. The legislation would set 8-year term limits for the Assembly, Speaker, as well as minority leaders in both chambers. Now, the Assembly Speaker, Carl Hastie, says that he's open to discussing term limits, but is not a big fan. Now, if you want to know where the public stands on this, there was a poll taken last month, and it was paid for by New Yorkers for term limits, so you can take a guess where this is going. And it found that more than 3/4 of New Yorkers support term limits, while just under 20% somewhat or strongly oppose them. Take that with a grain of salt. Listen, I've always been opposed to term limits because I always thought, let the electorate make up their own mind. They'll keep somebody there for 20 terms or 1 term, whatever they believe. But, and I'm going to go into the lion's mouth here, I'm more open to maybe reconsidering that, because if it can break some of the dysfunction and some of the cronyism in there.
It doesn't. It's not related to that. It is a tactic to weaken legislative function in a democracy, and it's the wrong thing to do. As long as you have a system where executives are as powerful as they are, you need an equally powerful legislator to balance it. That's the big issue. I don't care if you're Republicans or Democrats.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate with you. Shelley Silver accrued his power and built up his power base not over the first 2, 4, 6, 8 years, but over a lifetime in politics. He built up the chits that he got the leverage he got over a career. If you look at politics as a vocation and not as a career,
why should you? B, that's not what happened. Shelley Silver maintained the confidence of his members because he was the world's best negotiator. Now, he was doing other things that apparently, perhaps, were wrong, but the notion that no one can do the job over that amount of time and do it well is nonsense.
Okay, Dominic?
I feel the exact opposite on this one of Mr. Brodsky. He does bring the perspective of having served in the legislature, and if I lived in his district, and I say this sincerely, I would be honored. I see the smirk, but I really would be honored if he were my lawmaker.
He hates when you do this. That's why it's so
however, some, I'm not going to say all tonight, some elected officials up in Albany are not like Mr. Brodsky. They do go into it for a career and longevity and for all that they can line their pockets with. And that is the mentality. And so term limits is a fantastic thing. Nonsense. I am not a supporter of paying them more, because if you pay them more, there are some that are only going to look for ways to steal more.
Well, before I get into the pay thing, let me bring this side of the table. Andrew, we've talked about this before at this table. Is there ever a tipping point where you say it's for the betterment of the whole legislature if we put a cap so there's a beginning and an end to their time and they're not trying to do whatever they do to get along to go along?
No. No. And first of all, with the specific bill about capping the leadership positions, the Republican-led House did that. And they've set a limit on how long their people can be speakers, and I think it has hurt the effectiveness of the House in Washington. I think things work more efficiently, and I think Shelley Silver arguably ran the Assembly more efficiently because he had the experience and the sort of the tricks of the trade. Whether he also used that experience to line his own pockets is another question, but you know, if I have a good lawmaker, I want to send my good lawmaker back time and time again to represent my district as effectively as possible.
I remember in the campaign, Rob talked about if elected, he'd only serve for 2 terms, right? Well, it was obviously popular politically if you look at the polls there. But do you believe there's such a thing as a corruption over time of the soul if you're there too long?
Absolutely. And Rob started a new political line in New York, the Reform Party, which stands for 2 things: repealing Common Core and bringing term limits to the state legislature. I think I didn't used to be a term limit guy. I became one. But I think George Washington, from the beginning of the Republic, set the example by stepping down after 2 terms. He shocked the world when he did that because no one had seen someone voluntarily give up power. What happens, the problem in Albany is coziness. The coziness that develops between legislators and lobbyists and special interest groups and unions. And you got to break up the coziness.
It takes you 6 years to figure out how to get a law passed.
So you got 2 years to do something good then.
And once you learn the ropes, you're out. You have a doctor. He's a good doctor, but I've had him too long.
Or make it 12. Or make it 12.
frustration at what's been going on is legitimate.
Boy, wait a
The-
second. Why do we have a president for only 2 terms?
Because executive branches, concentrated power is a bad thing. In modern democracies, the problem is overweening executives.
Would you extend that to governors and mayors too?
Yes, but to legislatures, the trick is to make them stronger, not to weaken them and make them
How
less
about limits
effective.
for committeeships that they can chair?
If they want to do that, if the majority wants to do that, there's no reason they can't do it like they've done in the Congress.
Richard,
but to
look
make
at the
that a
rate.
requirement is nutty. I was chairman.
not nutty.
It doesn't do any good.
Okay,
Look at the
but
legislatures that
but
they've
Assemblyman,
states
but
that have tried
Assemblyman,
it. Don't
how
call me
many,
Assemblyman.
how many elected officials
Listen,
ever lose re-election? How many?
Oh, those
3% in the
voters are really stupid. You're right.
Right, they go back,
voters,
and back, and back.
We
and
can't
back,
trust those
and back.
voters.
But they get to vote for the people that the unions put in there, or the special interests
That's
put
right.
in there.
The voters are stupid.
I agree with you, Don.
and can't be given the option of choosing
All
the
right.
person they want to
I
choose.
want to get through the
Please.
next one, and on the subject of
Please.
fighting, Andrew, mixed martial arts. There's a bill that would legalize this, and if this sounds familiar, it should. Time and time again, this comes up in Albany, but it seemingly just never gets past a brick wall. Really, it's one principal lawmaker. State Senate Committee for Cultural Affairs, Tourism, Parks, Recreation voted 9-4 backing the bill. It would make New York the 50th state in the country to legalize the sport. That's right. We have that
Sport?
distinction.
Did he say sport?
Well, I'll let you, if you could just hold it for a moment.
Let's step outside.
Governor Cuomo supports the move and said, I look at it more from an economic development point of view. This is a big sport. It's growing. And if it can create jobs and economic growth in the state of New York, then I'm interested in it. He also spoke to the argument that the sport's too violent by saying football is a violent sport, rugby is a violent sport. Some people would say politics is a violent sport. So I get the point. But to me, it's all about the economics and whether or not it creates more jobs. It is violent, but at 49, how about the argument all the other kids are doing it?
I mean, I think there's a valid argument there, and we have Madison Square Garden and other arenas around the state that aren't being utilized for this purpose. I'm probably the bad guy to ask because I just find the sport distasteful. I've tried to watch this activity, whatever you want to call it. I've tried watching it and I just can't get into it.
Oh, I think it's a sport. I
but
think
it-
tell
but
me
it-
the
but
difference
it-
between
but it-
boxing
but
I
and...
think I actually worked on this for a great state senator years ago who died last year named Senator Roy Goodman, and this was his bill to ban what was then Ultimate Fighting in New York. Richard, you may have worked on it in the Assembly. I don't know. But Roy came out there and Ultimate Fighting had very few rules, and you had people biting each other, and there was blood in the ring. And John McCain was another person that was an early
It was
opponent.
almost a
of
sideshow
Ultimate
in the
Fighting.
beginning, you know?
Yeah, it was a sideshow. But since that time, I think it has developed into a sport. I don't like it either. I don't like to watch it, but I think it's developed into a legitimate sport where it's a mix between kickboxing and regular boxing and wrestling. So I would say go ahead and do it in New York. But they've come a long way since Ultimate Fighting to where they are today.
It's not a sport. It's a bar brawl in a cage. You know, I love to have the chicken wire on the outside.
I definitely think you're short shrifting the skill that goes into this thing.
Oh no, it takes a lot of skill to be an armed robber. It doesn't mean that we want to legalize it. That was come on, was you like that one? I got a nod of approval from him on that one. Look, this notion that it's economic development, the governor doesn't mean that and doesn't believe it. Doesn't believe in the legalization of marijuana, it would create jobs. Doesn't believe in the legalization of prostitution, would create jobs. Some things.
But wait a second. If to the north in Connecticut, it's legal. To the south in New Jersey, it's legal. To the west in Pennsylvania, if it's legal everywhere else in the country, at some point, is this, Don Quixote approach that we're not going to do it, but it's going on every single place, including in New York, but not sanctioned.
If you want to come to New York, you're just going to have to get by without watching people kick each other in the mouth.
It's coming, Richard. The major opponent of this was Sheldon Silver, who blocked every initiative as it related to this. Whether we like it or not, it's occurring in almost every other state. Trust me, it's coming to New York.
But just from a procedural level, one lawmaker could just kill this
No,
thing.
not one.
That's
the
not
speaker.
what happened. What happened was a guy named Bob.
Guccione.
No.
Was the guy behind
No,
it?
the assemblyman from Albany, a very decent guy, had been in the seminary.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
Decided to make a crusade out of it.
Yeah. And Roy in the Senate.
And they went out and convinced the committee I was on, which is Tourism, Sports, and the Arts, to disapprove the bill. So the notion that, where he gets his information from
No, but
is
wait,
beyond me.
But if this came to a floor vote right now in Albany, this thing would pass.
I don't know about right now. I can tell you 4 or 5 years ago,
Oh, I can't speak then, but it
they
definitely would
stopped
now.
the bill in committee on a fair fight.
Okay. Somebody's going to one day tell me how boxing is poetry in motion here, and what I just saw is such a far distant cousin from it. But anyway, head over to Facebook and Twitter and sound off on our question tonight. Is it time for New York to legalize mixed martial arts? Whatever it's worth, I say yes.
Martial arts? How about calling it
The
bar fighting?
budget battle continues in New York. Governor Cuomo's budget is being called the budget poison pill. Opponents say Cuomo's budget, it would put tuition assistance at risk by denying nearly $1 billion in state aid to more than 300,000 college students in the state. Now this, if the legislature fails to provide assistance to illegal immigrants and tax credits to supporters of parochial schools. Many are also questioning how the $5 billion windfall ought to be spent. All right, without getting too much in the weeds on the budget process and surprising the lack of vocal opposition to how the governor crafted this, same question I'll start with you, Bill. You have a one-time only windfall of $5 billion. What's the best way to spend it if you're the governor?
Infrastructure. You put it into infrastructure. Tappan Zee locally and other infrastructure projects around the state. We need about $50 billion. So that's the start.
Andrew?
Give it to me. I think.
Wait a minute, let's think about that.
It's the only honest answer you're going to get out of this table tonight. I agree. Infrastructure needs a lot of work. I would give it to schools for education as well, and I would make a down payment on the Tappan Zee Bridge.
Part of infrastructure, Dom?
Perhaps do what Bloomberg did. It was controversial at the time, but it paid off, and that is save the money for a rainy day, perhaps.
It's a one-time revenue. You use it for one-time expenditures. You don't put it into education, as important as education is.
What about like building new schools or getting some
Well,
computer
wait a minute, that's
access?
capital.
Yeah,
And I mean, call that infrastructure, whatever. But the fight in Albany, there's agreement on that. The fight in Albany is about the governor's attempt to override that principle and give himself the unilateral power to decide to use the
In
money.
fact, he
for
condemned
operating
what the legislature want to do as pork barrel projects, and he said it's not going to happen on his watch, where
Well-
lawmakers get to decide where the money's going to go to which districts, et cetera.
That is not the proposal in the legislature. The proposal in the legislature is to put the money into capital one-time projects, which is the only sensible way to do it.
Because you'll never be able to do it later.
These other things are the kind of fiscal gimmickry that's gotten Detroit into trouble, that's gotten other states into trouble. It's enough already. And the governor can say what he wants, but the bill copy is the bill copy, and he undoes that principle.
Dominic, this one to you. As we all know, the U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara, he's made a lot of headlines here, and he's made committing to fighting corruption in Albany job number one. But he's also facing some criticism of his own over the handling of it. Now, Shelley Silver's attorney says that Bharara and the media have ruined Silver's chances of fair trial. This week, though, I want to read you what the columnist Bennett Gershman had to say, and tell me if he's onto something. This appeared in Slate. He takes a shot at Bharara, saying that he should prosecute and not proselytize. He also went on to say that Bharara plays by different rules than other prosecutors. And in effect here, he all but convicted Silver before Silver had his day in court. Is this, U.S. attorneys before him, think Rudy when you covered him, or certainly, attorney generals in state after state, they do the same thing? Or did Bharara cross a different line here?
Well, when you're the U.S. attorney for the Southern District, that's a different job. It's perhaps one of the highest federal prosecutor profiles in the country. What Bharara is doing now is nothing new. You mentioned Rudy. Rudy did all of this first. Now, if I'm Silver's legal team, I'm pushing for a new venue, just like they did in the Amadou Diallo case.
You're saying what you'd expect.
Okay, because
but
if you get a different venue, he might have a shot at winning. But if Silver's tried here in New York, bye-bye. I mean, but what Bharara is doing does cross the line. He's not elected to anything. He's appointed. And he's going on these speaking tours. He's throwing all of these comments out there. And at the end of the day, remember what Giuliani did. His team would call us. We're walking him out the front door at 6:01 so you can take it live. And sure enough, they'd walk you out the front door at 6:01. It didn't matter if you committed suicide, if your wife committed suicide. And then 3 years later, when it's all out of the headlines, you were cleared and won the case in court.
Would have been tricked if you committed suicide and they walk you out at 6:01, but I'm with you.
If
Don,
anybody could, Giuliani
yeah.
could.
Andrew, the stay tuned, do you have any problem with that when we heard it?
No, I mean he's appears to be effective at what he does. He seems to be focusing on an area that clearly needs some prosecution and some investigation. All of this is just sniping. Just shut up and let him do
what
his
makes him
job.
effective? What makes him effective?
He seems to be.
He indicts people and convicts
He's
them.
brought
I think it's all
charges.
just that, yeah.
He hasn't convicted the big fish yet.
They're both right. He's been
I'm
an
going to write
effective
down the time and day you
prosecutor.
said that.
Well, when it happens again, I'll let you know.
Haley's comment will come first.
86 years. Yeah.
Get
A
right,
summer
we won't have a
solstice,
problem.
yeah.
The problem is when he strays from even his unfair characterizations of indictments, and he starts talking about the system, the political system. 3 men in the room. He doesn't know anything about it. He should keep his mouth shut. As to the fact that prosecutors use journalists, you journalist, you.
Are you implying
I
that
am
I'm used?
implying. Yes.
You know,
That
most
should stop.
you know,
Prosecutors
Bill,
do.
though, if you just step back for a second, whether it was Cuomo or Spitzer before him, the Attorney General of New York, I think it's the best gig going in politics. You get to pick which causes you want to go after. You get to basically make your own press conferences whenever you're after. Nobody's going to debate with me that Bahar has had a much better last couple of years here than certainly Mr. Schneiderman has. So whether it's optics or theater or whatever, he's doing something right. But do you take issue at all with how he does it?
I get on my knees every morning and thank God that Preet has come to New York. At the same time, I think the criticism is fair. I agree with Richard. I think doing a broad brushstroke is dangerous. We're talking about individual allegations, and individuals have a right to fight them. I think the criticism is fair. I think he's doing a wonderful job. I do root him on, but he's got to be careful on that.
Yeah.
Schneiderman hadn't brought any Albany corruption cases. He's also a former state senator. I can't help but wonder if the two might be connected somehow.
Aha. When we come back on the other side of the break here, I'm going to head out to Missouri. I'm trying to talk over a Missouri official who was running for governor, has taken his own life. And many people point to a possible whisper campaign that screamed anti-Semitism. The question I'm going to have is this a lot more prevalent in American politics than maybe some of us imagine? We'll talk about that and more after the break.